It's good to see you today. This is Gloria Donahue again with Nana's Cookery. And we're going to talk cookies. From the comments I get from a lot of you, I think you're new bakers. And the holiday season is a perfect time to start and maybe make cookies. And I just want to tell you something basically about them. First of all, to make cookies, you need cookie sheets. I would suggest that you have at least 2, because when you go to bake cookies, you can maybe only put 12, 16 on a sheet, and it would take you all day for a recipe that calls for maybe 48 cookies. So having 2 sheets is good. Rotate those sheets during the baking and maybe even shift them from one shelf to another just to make sure that everything is baking the same way, because you cannot always tell that the temperature is the same in the oven. I highly recommend parchment paper. Parchment paper I have in big sheets and cut them down, but you can buy them by the roll in the grocery store. And the big advantage of parchment paper is when you bake cookies, they will tell you to take them out of the either greased or ungreased, and I don't grease if I use the parchment paper. But when you take it out and you try to take them off immediately, they may be too soft. And so you let it sit for a while on a rack, and then you go to get them, and now they've stuck on the paper, on the pan, but they will not on the parchment paper. When the cookies are done, I simply slide the whole parchment paper off onto a cooling rack, and then I can take them off after they're cool. So that really works well. Let's talk about the type of cookies there are. There is a cookie called a drop cookie, and a drop cookie absolutely means that. You take a spoon, maybe you have a little special one that will work sort of like a scoop, or a soup spoon, a vegetable spoon, whatever the recipe tells you should be the general amount for a cookie. Find a spoon that works for that. Take your dough, bring it up against the side of the bowl, and put it onto the cookie sheet. It will tell you usually in a recipe how far apart the cookies should be. And the reason for that is because the cookies, if they have leavening in them, particularly baking soda or baking powder, they are going to spread. You don't want them to be touching each other and then making them difficult to be individual cookies. So follow the instructions for how far apart they should be on the cookie sheet. And that's a drop cookie. Now, in a drop cookie, it could be after you drop it, it's not going to be a perfect shape, it's just dropped on there. It could tell you to maybe flatten it a little bit with your hand, or maybe put a little sugar. Follow whatever instructions it says for that drop cookie. Now, there's such a thing called an icebox cookie. That sounds kind of silly, but of course it's the old name for a refrigerator. And an icebox cookie means that you're going to shape that dough, which will be soft, into usually a roll, not always a roll, but most commonly a roll. You're going to put it in the refrigerator long enough to firm up so that you can cut it into slices. That is the way you cook an icebox cookie. You cut it into slices. And again, follow the directions in that particular recipe. One that I make, and I'm going to hope to make later today, is one that I roll. It chills, then I roll it in beaten egg white and cinnamon sugar, and then slice it. So then each little cookie has that cinnamon sugar around it. But each recipe will tell you how you should do it. Another type of cookie is a cookie press, if you've ever heard of that. They're not all this way. Some of them you just turn, but there are different plates that you put in for different shapes. And if you've ever seen these little shaped cookies in the bakery or whatever, that's how they did it with a cookie press. It'll be recipes that usually specifically call for a cookie press. It's a soft dough, but firm enough to keep its shape after you put it on the thing. So what you would do is fill it, simply go over to your cookie sheet, and then you would do the cookies. You would not try to shape them elsewhere and put them on the cookie sheet. You would do it on, it will be too soft. You do it right on the cookie sheet. And there are lots of different plates and lots of different ways to decorate them. A rolled cookie, and that is where you have your reindeer, your snowman, all the things that people decorate. That dough is usually chilled for quite a while because soft cookie dough will not roll well. And you would need so much flour. I tried it when I was a young baker and I didn't like rolled cookies at all. I thought, oh, my mother made wonderful ones, but mine I have to use way too much flour. Well, I think the secret was I wasn't chilling the dough enough, and it really has to be a cold cookie dough. Then I do it between wax paper like I do my pie crust, and then roll it out to the right form, and then use the different cutters that you would have, and you can buy those in any bakery store to do that kind of a cookie. Then you also have shaped cookies, which, for instance, I make almond balls, or Mexican wedding cakes is another name for them. Again, you take an even amount of cookie dough, so you want to find out what spoon or what utensil gives me the correct amount for each one, because when you do a dish of cookies, you want them all to be the same because they're going to cook the same. So you want to make sure that they all cook at the same time and in the same manner. So it can be a shaped cookie in this regard. Mine, you take a spoon for the almond balls and you roll it into a ball. And you put all the balls on the cookie sheet. Now in that particular case, there's no leavening in those cookies. There's no baking powder, no baking soda. The cookies can be put much closer together. Why? Because they're not going to spread very much. They're going to stay as they are until they're done. And then you may, when those particular cookies come out, then you roll them in confectioner sugar. You have to look at each recipe, follow through from step to step what they're asking you to do, what the ingredients are, and how those cookies are going to be formed, how they're going to be shaped, how they're going to be baked, and how they're going to be cooled. The other thing before I go on with the others is that, in recipes, when a recipe calls for 4 eggs, nobody says break the eggs and use it. We all know that that means it's an egg that's already out of its shell. But very often you'll see recipes that call for butter. Certainly in cookies, every recipe. And if it says cream it, then start with room temperature butter. You cannot cream cold butter. Cream is really mixing very, very well butter and sugar, and you've seen that on many of my recipes. But the butter or cream cheese, whatever it is, something that would normally be in the refrigerator has to be room temperature for it to be creamed successfully. So that's just one of the things about the ingredients in a cookie. Another type of cookie would be squares. Very typically they call them in Canada that we're having squares, and every party I was ever to had squares. And lemon squares, for instance, that I make all the time. Brownies are squares, and that is anything that is placed into a pan, probably either an 8x8 or a 13x9 or a jelly roll pan. Now if it's a jelly roll pan, that is a longer, flatter pan, but with slightly raised sides. And there are cookies, the almond cookies that I have on the site was done in a jelly roll pan. That is patted in, you do whatever it says, and when they come out of the oven, you cut them. And very frequently when they're done in the jelly roll pan, it is a thin lower crust, and you do cut it into bars while it's just out of the oven. But that doesn't mean you remove them, you cut them and let them sit. Shortbread is another square cookie, and if you've ever had shortbread, then you know that's quite a firm, hard cookie. And when you pat shortbread into a form or a pan, very often the instructions will tell you to take a fork, and with the tines of the fork, measure out the sides of what you want, because it's very hard to cut the shortbread if it's all in one piece after it's baked. So what happens is you mark it, you bake it, and then again you go along those lines that you had previously cut, and then you let it cool. Brownies, of course, are all one thing. When you make the brownies, you're done. But there are many squares that are more than one layer, and that would be, for instance, lemon squares. Sometimes it's all put together and baked at the same time, with a bottom, a filling, and a top. But other times, like lemon squares, you're going to bake that bottom layer first, and then you're going to take it out and you're going to put the upper layer on it and bake it again. So that's really just a little primer on cookies. I suggest that you try them this holiday. Everybody loves them. You know, I almost don't make cookies except for the holidays. And I wondered why, because I like all the cookies I make. And I tend to make the same cookies every Christmas because everybody has their favorite that they want. And I think one of the reasons is that when you sit down to have a piece of pie or a piece of cake, you're very aware that you're sitting down to have a dessert. With a cookie, it's just so easy to walk past the plate and take one. And then another, boy, that tastes like another one. And so maybe I just don't want them around for that reason, because they are so good. But I hope this cookie primer has been a help to you. I hope you have a wonderful holiday making cookies. I make trays every year. I have almond butter crunch on the bottom, cookies and other candies all around it, and give it out to families and friends. And it is one of the joys of my life, and I hope it will be one of yours, to do what you love and share it with others. Bye-bye. Thanks again for visiting.